Price of sugar's crashed, diesel's gone through the roof, and fertiliser, well, maybe it's lucky that it's been restricted by reef regulations because it can't afford it anyway. So why bother with the science checking problem? This is one of those problems that's important but not usually the most urgent. It's easy to put it off. But when it does become urgent, it's then too late. Like when reef regulations were introduced in 2019, all based on unchecked science. And what was done then could easily be made worse the next time Labor gets into power. Much worse. We have a chance right now with a relatively farmer-friendly government to push back against these regulations based on unchecked science and to kind of vaccinate ourselves against the worst effects when Labor gets back into power. That's why we've got a plan to get the science checking started. It can start tomorrow using the newly created Queensland Productivity Commission. All we need to do is show the government that we want it and that it's a good, fair idea, and to convince the people in the southeast corner that it's a good, fair idea. After all, who's going to argue against a bit more checking of the science? I certainly can't imagine that the government would argue against that. So let's go back to 2019 and the reef regulations. Now, the scientists say that you are killing the reef. They say that your fertiliser is making the algae grow, choking the coral, that the sediment coming off your farm is smothering the coral, and that the pesticides that you apply are killing the coral. They say that you have barely improved and that you are still killing the reef. And if the science says that you are killing the reef, there is no redemption for you. There is no escape from the ramp up of the regulations. It's just a question of how long and how much. Now, they even claim really crazy things like they talk about the freshwater ecosystems of the Great Barrier Reef are worst affected by farming, right? Now, think about that. The freshwater ecosystems of the Great Barrier Reef. The Great Barrier Reef is 50 to 100 kilometres usually over the horizon out to sea. There are no freshwater parts of the Great Barrier Reef. But if you look at it from their point of view, they can't measure any pesticides on the Great Barrier Reef, even with the most sensitive scientific equipment. There is negligible sediment out there, and there's far more natural nutrients or fertiliser in the water than comes from the farms. So they need to define the reef closer to the shore and up the rivers and the creeks, because then they can say, well, it's all connected, so that if a fish is effective in the creek at the bottom of your paddock, well, that's now damaging the reef. Now, I think it might be a pretty good idea to check that evidence, to use the term very loosely, that they use for this. In fact, that science has never been properly checked. It's never been properly audited and never subject to official scrutiny. So when somebody like me stands up and calls it out with a few facts, well, guess what? They ignore me. They can ignore me. If I was them, that's exactly what I would do. And they can ignore you or any individual. They can even ignore cane growers or ag force. But I'll tell you what they cannot ignore. The Queensland Productivity Commission. Let's say the new Queensland Productivity Commission starts some science checking, and we want them to start with a very simple test case. In fact, it's whether the Burnett and Mary rivers should have any reef regulations. And let's say the Queensland Productivity Commission in their report point out some inconvenient facts, like those rivers don't even run into the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park. An ocean current's 300,000 times bigger take any river water south away from the reefs. Now, that's in an official report by an independent organisation, and those scientists who claim that you are killing the reef cannot ignore the Queensland Productivity Commission the way they can ignore me or even Cane Growers organisation. They will now be forced to engage in the argument that they have been studiously trying to avoid for decades, and they will lose. Now, this use of the Queensland Productivity Commission, it's an easy fix. We've done all the background work, and even a government committee has agreed that it can do science checking. And in fact, the Crisafulli government has referred the appalling federal nature positive legislation to the Queensland Productivity Commission. But that's federal legislation, and the state government can't do a whole lot about that, but it can do something about the appalling Labor legislation, which it is now looking after very carefully by not repealing, or at least not analysing whether some of that should be repealed. So we think that it would be a very good idea for the QPC to actually start not with the federal legislation, but with a bit of state legislation. So you might think, well, I'm in the Burdekin, I'm in a different river catchment, and I don't really care so much about the Burnett Mary. But remember, this is just a test example. Once we get the framework established within the QPC, we will be able to go on to other issues, other industries, other regions. They will follow. So can I just stop here and just ask you to think about all the regulations that you've got? And wouldn't it be nice if we could finally start to push back against that? The sum total just crushing the whole agricultural industry. So we've sent out invitations to the various sugar organisations like Cane Growers, QCAR, Clamia, AgForce, asking them to join. We need your support too. You can start right now by signing the petition, or you can go to the AF webpage. There's lots of videos that are going up on the various web pages. And keep a lookout. This campaign has really only just started. We might have to go for a little while as we gather support across the state and also the nation. The contact details are below, and if you want to contact me, feel free. There's a campaign phone number and various other contacts down there. Thank you.